Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the symposium on the politics of dignity, whose dignity counts and who decides. My name is Ibrahim Musa. I'm co-director of the program in Contending Modernities. I'm professor of Islam in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and also affiliated to the Keough School. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you here today. There's about 8 undergraduates who have to be here, but otherwise, I'm very grateful for your attendance. And also very delighted to welcome our panelists who I will introduce in a few minutes. Just in terms of timing, we are thinking that we will close this at around about 1:45. And if any of you have to go, if you can do that as unobtrusively as possible before that. But we will not imprison you here any longer than that, unless the conversation is really dignified. So you know, I want to say something about the 3 panelists, and I'm not going to go into great detail because there are 3 of us who are kind of local, and you can find their detailed profiles on the website of the law school and the Kroc Institute. But I have on my far right, she's not normally right, she's on the left of things, Professor Atalia Omer, a professor of religion, conflict, and peace at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and my colleague and co-director of the Contending Modernities program. Professor Omer works on peace and the challenges of nationalism, and she studies multiculturalism and a whole host of other issues, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Professor Doug Castle is a Notre Dame Presidential Fellow in the law school and a scholar and practitioner on international human rights law. He has been active on the global scene to restore rights of people from Colombia, Peru, Venezuela to Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Welcome to Professor Castle, who I had the good fortune of meeting in recent weeks. Professor Charles Villavicencio is a distinguished scholar of religion, a theologian, and a leading global authority in matters related to transnational justice and reconciliation. His contributions, apart from his contributions as a liberation theologian in South Africa for many decades, taught at the University of Cape Town, he's also, since then, been very instrumental from 1996 to 1998. He played a central role in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where Charles played the role of the National Research Director. And Charles has used his insight and expertise to advise numerous countries dealing with challenges of rebuilding and their societies after periods of internal strife, including Peru and various African nations. And last night we had a dinner, and he told me about these several visits to South Sudan and other parts of the continent. But Charles is here in particular because we go back a long time, and he's my guest, and he normally spends a semester at Georgetown University these days in the fall, and this would be his last stay at Georgetown as a visiting professor. So I thought I will catch him inexpensively flying him from Washington to South Bend, and but also as a way of honoring our relationship that we have developed over the years. During his tenure as chair of the department, I remember one day as a journalist working at the Cape Times, I decided that I had enough of covering apartheid, crimes, and other things, and maybe I need to isolate myself into the academia. So I went to Charles and I said, "Listen, do you have something for me here? I can do a master's and get away from all these things." And he said, "Of course, I see your name every day in the newspaper. You can write a half a sentence. So why didn't you join my program?" So he was my advisor in the master's program. He was also instrumental in hiring me at the University of Cape Town as a junior lecturer, and then we did all kinds of strange and funny things, including Charles has been a guest of apartheid's prisons many times, and he has a criminal record for resisting racism, but we won't hold that against him. And on one occasion, 2 of us almost went to jail together. If it wasn't for very clever lawyers that bailed us out at the last minute, and we were all painted in purple. It was known as the was it Purple Saturday, when they hosed us down with hoses by fire. What's the name? These fires, big kind of machines spraying purple on us. So we go back. I want to thank several people for making this possible. Dania Strawn for the Contending Modernities, the Center for Civil and Human Rights, Mr. Kevin Fye, Christine Sevenek, and Sean O'Brien, and all the people who made this event possible, and all of you for attending here. Let me say a few things as someone who came up with this idea, and I'm still now wondering, why did I come up with this idea of politics of dignity? But you'll soon see my anxieties. Human dignity as a moral and ethical category is frequently invoked in a range of contemporary discourses, from law to theology, and human rights and human development, sexuality, and gender debates. While human dignity means different things to different people, we use dignity as a cognate to honor and worth. Self-worth, our sense of worth, is one of the meanings that we have for dignity, but not the only one. Immanuel Kant famously talked about dignity as the radical autonomy of the noumenal self, whatever that noumenal self means, but somehow we begin to understand that there's something deep within us that we find to be the real source of our being, and that is what we respect and honor. Yet I have some concerns about how we deploy dignity in our discourse. Sometimes it can sound like a platitude, depending on its use. Indeed, human dignity is a category deeply entrenched in religious traditions, as well as in secular documents of morality and law. In very different times and moments in history, dignity was a moral currency prevalent in many cultures and civilizations different from ours. When we look back then, by today's standards, some pretty atrocious things were perpetrated in societies that also value dignity. Slavery, for instance. Sexual and racial discrimination stands out as examples in societies and cultures where dignitarian norms were part of the package of values, and yet these degraded practices took place. Some might argue that dignity was not the determining norm back then. We should debate that and discuss that. We should, to my mind, dignity is not power blind, nor is it above questions of culture and values. It is embedded in larger ensembles of cultural and moral practices. The question is this: if we today elevate dignity to a primary norm, as a Grundnorm above everything else, how are we going to determine whose notion of dignity applies? Is that a question that we should discuss? Like every concept we use and deploy in scholarship and in practice, dignity cannot be extricated from its cultural, political, and economic context, as well as the multiple, especially political and economic frameworks in which it is embedded. As scholars and public intellectuals, we ought to be aware of the questions that are masked and remain unasked, even when we invoke the concept of human dignity. I convened this panel primarily because, as much as I return to the concept of dignity, I'm also troubled by the fact that we use dignity often as a defense and a conversation stopper. The moment I say, this violates my dignity, or something like that, or so-and-so's dignity, it appears that the conversation is impeded. In other words, if I continue to contest or debate your viewpoint, once you've invoked dignity, it will be received and perceived as an affront to your personhood. Sometimes dignity is used within liberal contexts in order to make judgments about non-liberal societies. In other words, my concern is that dignity is being hijacked by certain forms of liberalism as part of a political ideology that overlooks its own indignities. So there's very little self-critique and self-reflection. So when I think of the concept of dignity, I also think of the politics of dignity, meaning the power of dignity. Power in the sense in which Foucault uses it means the way politics and power shapes and determines behavior. So is dignity talk a conversation stopper? Something I said earlier. And how can one talk about dignity without it becoming a conversation stopper? When we talk about dignity in a diverse context, in a global context, with intensive political and cultural rivalries and contestations, it appears to me at least that when dignity is invoked, the dignity is often the dignity of the home team, dignity of the ones who are articulating it. So I hope that we will be able, during the panel and during your interaction, be able to go back to questions such as refining the meaning of what is dignity, whose dignity becomes the benchmark, is dignity an abuse concept? What are the uses and abuses of dignity? Are there constructive ways, normatively inclusive ways of invoking and using the concept of dignity? Let's think of human dignity in less abstract ways and explore this concept in the light of concrete situational ethics, morality, law, theology, and politics. For instance, dignity and work and labor, sexuality, religious and secular conceptions of dignity, because religious concepts of dignity are not the only ones. Context of refugees, wars and conflicts, dignity and the construction of modernity. And here's a big question: can the modern be dignified? I'm trying hard here. We should certainly strive to do so, since we have no reason to reject the present, but we can reject the conditions of the present. I'm a little bit thinking that, the hand we have been given is possibly the most, I don't say the best hand, but the most reasonable hand that we've been given. So the goal here is to ventilate this concept of dignity in multiple traditions. And I think that we need to look at it in different ways and explore it carefully. These days, I find that often the dignity of the new tribe, that is the dignity of the nation state, that when the nation state is violated and takes us to war or to other malevolent destinations, we're also invoking the term dignity. In many places around the world, male dignity eclipses, I want to say trumps, but, and in fact, the word would fit in perfectly here. Male dignity eclipses female dignity, that of a free person over that of a slave in medieval times. You get my drift. Dignity in communitarian and agrarian societies function differently than in industrial and post-industrial societies. But these debates get suppressed, or the histories of trampled dignities under colonialism and imperialism often get overlooked or literally whitewashed by the West, which is coincidentally white. The other day, at the opening of the Keough School, a visiting bioethics professor from Harvard asked the question, how should we think of dignity? How should we think of the dignity of culture, the cultures in which people live? That was too long a question for that panel to answer, but I hope that we will be able to address it. In the modern period, there is a Western Christian triumphalism that only sanctifies a singular form of dignity, individual and atomistic, overriding communitarian forms of dignity, tradition-based forms of dignity, or other semiotic and embodied forms of dignity. That norm of individual dignity has also made its way into secular debates of dignity that valorizes autonomy. Now, in the light of last week's changes in healthcare rules and exemptions for people on the basis of their religious convictions not to fund practices that would offend their religious values, the outcome is that some people are pleased with that rule and others are displeased. Now here, I would favor the dignity of the individual to make certain choices in a liberal capitalist context. So I'm not entirely oblivious of the virtues of individual dignity. And I'm sure people are going to argue against that. So when I proposed the politics of dignity, I meant the exercise of power to determine the meanings and sensibilities of dignity. So what are the ideological and political implications, as well as the practical implications of concerns over dignity? In many parts of the world, respect for parents, teachers, and elders in a hierarchical order is still a sought-after sensibility of dignity. Those same societies might have to work much harder in order to correct the lack of respect for the dignity of women, since status respect for males on a hierarchy often does treat women differentially. But it does not have to remain that way, nor do the two have to be incompatible. Dignitarian ethics, dignitarian arguments center on both sides of, say, reproductive rights, Some think the power of dignity should be with the embryo. Others think dignity is with a woman's choice or her self-interest. It could also be an arduous battle of how to accomplish dignity of both or adjudicate between competing dignities. I'm not saying we should discuss these topics because some of them are fairly controversial, and we are at Notre Dame after all, and I'm just sharing how I am conflicted in thinking about these issues. The same goes with human rights. In some regions of the world, freedom of speech is an absolute right, including the right to offend religious icons and symbols. In other parts of the world, people's dignity would be deeply offended by such speech. If we do not factor in the politics of dignity and rights, we would certainly get things wrong. Hence, whose dignity, whose dignitarian reasons. And now I would call upon my panelists. I would ask first Professor Doug Castle. He could sit there or he could come here to speak for 7 to 10 minutes, followed by Professor Atalia Omer. And then we will have the creme de la creme by Professor Charles Volivasetsu. Thank you. Doug.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'll confess right at the outset that my own personal views tend toward the Catholic and the communitarian, but I'm here surrounded by religious experts, so I dare not enter into discussions on that level. Instead, I'll confine myself to the much more prosaic matter of international human rights law with a touch of comparative constitutional law, where I'm perhaps on sounder ground. And even there, I confess you're getting the junior varsity, because the leading international law scholar on dignity here at Notre Dame is Paolo Carrozza, who some of you may know, and who in the last decade has entered into interesting debates with Professor Chris McCrudden of the University of Michigan and Professor Jerry Newman of Harvard. Most of what I am about to say is my own personal distillation and reconfiguration of what I have read in the printed wisdom of those three scholars, along with a few principal texts. Since 7 to 10 minutes may not enable me to impart all of my wisdom to you, let me start with the answers to Ibrahim's questions, which are whose dignity counts and who decides? And the short answer in the field of human rights law is that everyone's dignity counts. And who decides that? At the first level, it's those who draft international treaties or constitutions, and the second level, the judges who interpret them. Now, a little bit of analysis. Until the 20th century, dignity was not a phrase that appeared much in international law or even in domestic constitutional law. Dignity really, like much of human rights law, got launched into the field of international law and constitutional law largely because of indignities, because of obvious indignities, because of intolerable indignities, because of the horrors of the Second World War, the Holocaust, the war crimes committed during that war against Russian POWs and others that were documented at Nuremberg. And so the three foundational documents of, I would say, modern international human rights law all made express reference to dignity. In the first of them, the UN Charter of 1945, the preamble states that we, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined, quote, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, end quote. Second foundational document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, end quote. The communitarian influence there of Catholic social teaching, among other influences. And finally, the complete revamping of the humanitarian laws of war in 1949 with the Geneva Conventions and Common Article 3 to all four of the 1949 Geneva Conventions includes among the acts prohibited with regard to persons who are not actively involved in hostilities, quote, outrages upon personal dignity, in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment. Another wave, there were many others, but another enormous wave of indignity in the 20th century, of course, was apartheid. And with the fall of apartheid brought, among other things, the South African Constitution of 1996, which repeatedly states that dignity is a key value underlying the Constitution. But it goes beyond that to make dignity an actual constitutional right. Article 10 of the South African Constitution provides that under the title Human Dignity, everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected, end quote. Now, since 1945 and since 1996, dignity appears in many international human rights treaties, in a number of national constitutions, and in a great number of judicial decisions under both. But what does dignity mean? I would suggest to you that there are three circles of meaning, and these are not entirely original with me by any means. The core meaning of dignity in law, and Jerry Newman and Chris McCrudden both put this forward, has three elements. First, that each human being has intrinsic worth, inherent value. I think it was Kant who would say, and maybe I'll get the philosophy wrong here, that human beings are ends, not means. Secondly, because we all have, without exception, intrinsic value, we all have the right to be treated by others with respect for that intrinsic value. And thirdly, particularly in the context of international law and constitutional law, all human beings have the right to be treated with respect for their dignity by the state. There are limits on what the state can do with regard to its citizens. So that's the first circle. And on that, the scholars agree that if you look at any of the international or constitutional legal instruments, there's broad agreement on those three concepts of dignity: inherent worth, the right to be treated by others with respect to that worth, and the right to be treated by the state without violation of that worth. But what does that really mean in terms of rights in practice? And that brings us to the second circle. I would suggest that there are certain universally or almost universally recognized outrages against dignity, which are unacceptable. Genocide, slavery, torture, massacres, starvation, indiscriminate, slaughter, and so forth. The real function of dignity, the value of dignity in international law and constitutional law, is to provide a moral justification for the universal bans on such practices. Now, of course, if we go back in history, we'll find them, as Ibrahim mentioned, widely practiced among states that consider themselves to be civilized, but in contemporary law, whether international or constitutional, all of those things are frowned on almost universally. Third is what I'll call, and this is my original contribution here for what little it's worth, just a label on what's already been recognized by other scholars, the outer circle of implications of dignity in law. And these are all debatable and contested topics such as abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, poverty relief, rights to gender identity and sexual orientation, hate speech, privacy. All of these, when applied by judges under different instruments in different places, come up with a variety of answers. They're not uniform answers. It's common to all of them that dignity is taken into account, but the application of applying dignity differs on issues like those. So if dignity has many meanings, how can we accommodate that with their incorporation in law? And international courts and constitutional courts use at least four approaches in dealing with dignity. First is they recognize that dignity is often on both sides of the ledger. One person's dignity against another person's dignity. A woman's right to choose to have an abortion or not arguably involves her right of autonomy, her dignity right of autonomy, whereas, of course, the right to life of an unborn fetus involves the dignity of that fetus in terms of the right to life. So both parties in that dispute have dignity. Which prevails? And depending on the culture you're in or the judge before whom you appear, even on the United States Supreme Court, the court of a single country, you get different answers. Different answers come out. Second, dignity appears sometimes as a limitation on rights, not necessarily a clash of rights, but a limitation on rights. For example, free speech. By the way, it's not an absolute right anywhere, Ibrahim. It's always limited by something, although the United States probably comes closer than any other legal culture to calling it absolute. But generally speaking, in international human rights law, free speech, privacy, and many other human rights can be limited when limitations on those rights are necessary in the interests of a democratic society. Notice I said interests, not rights. For example, hate speech. The speaker has a dignitarian right to self-expression, but the victim of hate speech has a dignitary right to respect for their dignity. How do you balance those two? In the United States, generally speaking, priority is given to the dignity of the speaker. In most of the world, strict limits are placed on the extent to which speech is allowed to offend other people on the basis of their race, religion, or other such characteristics. A third way that judges deal with dignity is as an interpretive guide to other rights in deciding how far the right of privacy, or even if there is a right of privacy, for example, sexual privacy, dignity is taken into account in figuring out how to interpret various human rights. And fourth, there is dignity as a right itself. As I mentioned, it's recognized as such by the South African Constitution. Almost all of the rights in which dignity is involved, and the right of dignity itself is not absolute. It is fundamental. It appears in all of these legal instruments. Its importance is undeniable, but that does not make it absolute. In all of international human rights law, perhaps the only right that is absolute is the prohibition against torture, notwithstanding the attitudes of some lawyers from the United States Justice Department during the second previous administration, and perhaps, unfortunately, the current one as well. So dignity is fundamental, and it's vital to international human rights law. It may be, and in fact it is, in my view, the single most important value underpinning human rights law, whether international or constitutional. I would place it above the other fundamental values that underlie human rights law, which include, among others, equality, autonomy, liberty, security, and community. But dignity, at least in law, is not a conversation stopper. It's a conversation starter. It can be limited by the dignity of others and by other rights and interests. And many of these limits are, as Ibrahim, I think, rightly stated, shaped by the diversity in this world of religious views, of political traditions, and legal cultures. All of that leads me to three conclusions. First, we can all agree in the world of law on the importance of dignity. Second, but we don't always agree on what it means in a particular context, particularly when it is against competing rights and interests and dignities. And third, in law at least, that's just fine. Within broad limits, the dignity of communities gives them the right to cultural pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay, so I would like to begin by acknowledging that today we are marking Indigenous Peoples Day, alternatively known as Columbus Day. reframing the day as one marking the legacy of colonialism, uprootedness, and genocide is significant for our discussion of the politics of dignity, because it brings to the fore questions concerning grievability and ungrievability. It illumines how dynamics of dehumanization have rendered a multiplicity of humans ungrievable in the course of the history of modernity, a history that also witnessed the articulation of the language of rights and human dignity under the post-World War II's sentiment of never again. Of course, there have been many, many agains, many recurrent attacks on human dignity, which then facilitate ungrievability. The question of ungrievability is not a matter buried in 1492 or World War II, but rather an ongoing struggle for our communities globally and locally at a time of constant drone attacks, threats of nuclear wars, massive waves of refugees, absolute poverty, relative poverty, closing of public schools in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago, for instance, and assaults on LGBTQI communities and women's rights to their bodies and their capabilities. So I draw on feminist philosopher Judith Butler's articulation of ungrievable lives as those that cannot be lost and cannot be destroyed because they already inhabit a lost and destroyed zone. They are ontologically and from the start already lost and destroyed, which means that when they are destroyed in war, nothing is destroyed. Butler, accordingly, in her really important collection of essays, Frames of War, demonstrate that overcoming the apparent radical inequality that characterizes the difference between grievable and ungrievable lives would involve cultivating a more radical and effective form of egalitarianism. The principle of human precariousness as a generalizable condition, not attached to particular life, but lives in general, is foundational for Butler's push for radical equality. It implies dependency on social networks and conditions, suggesting that there is no life itself at issue here, but always and only conditions of life as something that requires conditions in order to become livable life, and indeed in order to become grievable. The shared condition of precariousness leads not to reciprocal recognition, but to a specific exploitation of targeted populations, of lives that are not quite lives, cast as destructible and ungrievable. Such populations are losable or can be forfeited precisely because they are framed as being already lost or forfeited. They are cast as threats to human life as we know it, rather than as living populations in need of protection from illegitimate state violence, famine, etc. The framing of subjects in the vast colonies as barbarians authorized their ungrievability and continues to do so. Importantly, to reiterate the last point, what is at stake is not an imperative to preserve life at all costs, but rather to stress human obligation to sustain life as sustainable, and to the conditions that make life possible, not to life itself, because without those sustaining conditions, there can be no sustained life. So in agreement with Butler, I understand this focus on sustaining conditions for livability in terms of political obligations, and pivotal for our discussion of the politics of dignity. The radical inequality in terms of grievability and ungrievability, the kind that allow the many genocides of modernity, including the one we mark today, is embedded in layers of racism, Orientalism, and the logic of biopolitics. Gil Anijar, in his book, The Jew, the Arab, examined the paradigmatic image of the Muslim of Auschwitz, the bare life, the ungrievable, near almost annihilated Jew, so close, who is nicknamed Muslim. Musliman comes from Muslim. One can think of W.E.B. Du Bois' reflection from the post-war reflection after the conclusion of World War II in a really important essay titled "The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto," where he links the problem of racial division to spatial and temporal one. Du Bois writes, and it is worth to read some portions of a passage. So I quote, "The result of these 3 visits to the ghetto, to Warsaw Ghetto, and particularly of my view of the Warsaw Ghetto, was not so much clearer understanding of the Jewish problem in the world as it was a real and more complete understanding of the Negro problem. In the first place, the problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer in my mind a separate and unique thing, as I had so long conceived it. It was not even solely a matter of color and physical and racial characteristics, which was particularly a hard thing for me to learn, since for a lifetime, the color line had been a real and efficient cause of misery. The race problem in which I was interested cut across lines of color and physique and belief and status and was a matter of cultural patterns, perverted teaching, and human hate and prejudice, which reached all sorts of people and caused endless evil to all men." It's talking about men. This situation of absolute erasure, which Du Bois saw in the remains of Warsaw, of the ghetto, and I continue to quote, predicated on absolute separation, contextualizes the Negro problem, what he calls the Negro problem, not in the sense that Warsaw somehow belittles or trumps American racism, but rather insofar as it reveals the more subtle and insidious operation of the color line in the very different political geography of Jim Crow America, end of quote. And of course, now we are talking about the new Jim Crow, and as Michelle Alexander examines it. The interconnection among the sites of ghettoization can be explained through an application of what Agamben, following Foucault, calls a biological continuum. The intersectional analysis that animates global social justice activism and allyship with a variety of ungrievables these days, today, involves exposing the global operation of white supremacy through foregrounding structures, not necessarily identities, in order to highlight sameness that clarifies the way that Du Bois did, the interconnected nature of social justice struggles, of the ungrievable and the invisibilized through practices of spatial and temporal separation and othering. It is through this lens that Cornel West talks about Gaza as the hood on steroids, denoting structural interconnectedness of sites of domination and conceptual continuity in all manifestations of racism and white supremacy. It is through this lens that Standing Rock Cirques is connected to anti-Black police brutality in the US, to the occupation and uprootedness of Palestinians, to struggles against Islamophobia and anti-immigration, to environmental racism and poverty, relative and absolute. This demonstrates a critical process for cultivating conceptions of grievability, of those whose grievability was diminished within the reigning discourses. The language of reclaiming dignity is central in the movement. One needs only to look at the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or the platform of the movement for Black Lives. But it is deeply that the use of dignity is deeply rights-based, rejecting the discursive differentiation of rights, including the fluid capabilities approach, from dignity as a concept grounded in supposedly other sources, such as tradition or cosmology. The focus on precariousness demands examining the socio-political and ideological conditions that contributes to and authorize the biopolitical continuum that Du Bois talked about and identified, and its constant assault on human dignity. In my view, if the employment of dignity is lacking consistency on dignitarian principles, it serves to preserve the radical inequalities underpinning the realities of ungrievability, as Butler articulated. Unless human dignity rests on or implies a right to have rights, any political and legal discourse of human dignity will be inadequate in comparison to the systematic and concrete protections offered to citizens by constitutions and constitutional rights. The right to have rights is a reference to Hannah Arendt, who wrote from her experience as a Jewish refugee about the condition of statelessness when Jews were evacuated of their citizenship, and with this lost the right to have rights, which then enabled their extermination. And I quote from Arendt, "Men, it turns out, can lose all so-called rights of men without losing his essential quality as man, his human dignity. Only the loss of a polity itself expels him from humanity," end of quote. So Arendt rejected the abstraction of the human, which is, of course, by the way, highly gendered, obviously, with male human functioning as the normative human, because being human qua human simply doesn't entail any rights, nor others' obligation toward you. Even the right to have rights, which he highlights as the only transcendent right, is itself dependent on mutual agreement and guarantees within communal bounds. Sayla Ben Habib, one of Arendt's most important readers, explains that Arendt articulates here a moral imperative and claim to membership. This is the kind of membership that biopolitics operates against. Christoph Menke, another reader of Arendt, explains that according to Arendt, human dignity is no natural property which human beings are endowed with individually and which subsequently would have social consequences, but it consists in nothing other than their political linguistic existence. Their speaking, judging, and acting with and vis-a-vis others. Once again, what is highlighted here is the crucial distinction between the abstract Homo sapien, endowed with some sort of inert sanctity, and the person who is recognized as a political actor, invested with rights, and the member of a political community. For Menke, this demands an anthropology of a political linguistic form of life, as opposed to an anthropology of quasi-natural human needs and interests. The right to have rights, therefore, is interpreted through the concept of recognition. It is preliminary recognition of persons, after which those persons living in a political community may recognize each other as having certain rights. Okay, so the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human, Arendt wrote. The discussion of human dignity entailing rights, duties, and obligations necessitates social and political recognition. And thus, I agree with Ibrahim, Professor Musa's framing that the language of dignity is by definition political and not self-evident nor innocent. Arendt opposed the inclination to authenticate abstracted humans through appeals to religious or quasi-religious foundations, because some abstract and general claims to the sacredness of humans simply do not compute empirically with the conditions of ungrievability. If only one side of ungrievability is foregrounded in dignitarian debates, then one is obliged to ask what and whose interest does this move serve? Therefore, the Movement for Black Lives platform, for instance, underscores Black solidarity with Palestinians, Latinx, Muslims, women, LGBTQI communities, and so forth. Indeed, my argument is that examining the politics of dignity, or rather the power dynamics entangled in the dignity discourse, needs to proceed through an epistemology from the margins. So next time you want to learn about the politics of dignity, ask Native Americans, transgendered persons, Black women and men, Gazan children who saw their homes destroyed multiple times from the sky, and refugees in displaced persons camp. If this discussion doesn't come in the form of epistemology from the margins, then dignity serves a status quo that exposes much more the elective affinity between the concept of dignity and the concept of honor and status, and less with the precarity and socio-political obligations that we all owe. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Whoops, I'm not going for the right here.
No.
Okay.
Just don't push that hard.
Okay, Ibrahim, thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. We go back a long, long way. I'm very grateful to the two speakers who've spoken before me. They've dealt with legal matters in a very helpful way. And I think you and I will find more in common and in difference than we realize tomorrow. And thank you too for your survey of the literature and the philosophy and of Hannah Arendt, who I read again and again because there's so much there. Thank you. I've never quite understood in life whether I am an academic or a social activist. And I've, from time to time, tried to do both, and I've gone this way and I've gone that way. Let me begin. Human dignity may, in fact, be the only hope that we have to survive and to maintain an increasingly fragile and disruptive planet Earth. Maybe we should talk not only of human dignity, but cosmic dignity. What I'm going to be arguing today is that we need a fundamental, major cultural transformation in the world. We need to ensure that the culture that makes us what we are and think the way we think needs to be changed. Not easy. Max Weber used to say, culture is not a light cloak that you throw over your shoulders and then remove again when the weather's a little better. Culture is you. It is me. It is in the marrow of our bones. It is who we are. And my understanding of history is that we create this culture, and then it creates us, and we will fight very often to the very end to maintain that culture. Kicking and screaming, we cling to our culture because it's superior to anybody else's, of course. I want to do two things. One, I would like to just reflect a little bit on the history, the cultural history, the intellectual history, the religious history that we as the human race have traveled through in recent years. I'm then going to move forward and to suggest that if we're talking about human dignity, we're talking about the transformation of fundamental human structures. Dignity means far more than being nice to the street person outside. Dignity ensures that all of us who call ourselves human have the basic necessities, the basic requirements to live a more or less dignified life. History, culture, and religion changes continually. History, culture, and religion. Maybe it is those three that give us the clearest insight into what we believe about ourselves and about culture. This history, this culture, this religion, this self-understanding is always becoming. And we in our modern age look back to certain earlier periods, including some of our religious texts, sacred texts. And we read there of all sorts of funny things, of how we ought to treat women, how we ought to treat slaves, what we ought to do with apostates, and so on. These were all reflections of the culture at the time. Today, I hope we have a different culture. Just think about that for a moment. I understand that women are even able to drive cars in Saudi Arabia.
In a few months' time.
In a few months' time. Any self-respecting Wahhabi would say, my goodness, what is this world coming to? On the other hand, I was reading this last week that there is a former Alabama Chief Justice, one called Roy Moore, who's now apparently an aspirant Republican candidate for the Senate, who insists, and listen to this, Doug, who insists that the removing of the Christian God from the institution and practice of law is an apostasy. So, who's ahead? Saudi Arabia or the United States? My question is, does mainstream religion, as a reflection of culture and self-belief, does mainstream religion enhance the dignity of human beings or not? All human beings. Well, I think the answer is both yes and no. You see, we project an understanding of the infinite God. We who are finite, we who are locked in our finitude, project an understanding of the infinite God. We create that God in terms of our limitations, and then we seek to mimic that God in our behavior. That's the paradox. That's the paradox I want to suggest. We project a God, and then we take that God into our own lives and say that is how we've got to belong, how we've got to behave, and what we have got to do. I am suggesting there is a correlation between our perception of God passed down through culturally specific and oppressive means and folklore. There is a correlation between that understanding of who God is and the way in which we behave as human beings. If our projection of God is an austere, indomitable, and overwhelming God with biases towards one tribe or one group over against another, then sooner or later we will find ourselves behaving exactly as that God behaves. And we too will be prejudiced in this direction or that. And we will create the world around us in terms of that God-like projection that we have. This is seen in 19th century mission work. People going out there and converting the natives, as they say. It's there in subtle ways, of course, in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, in Fukuyama's essay on the end of history. There is a correlation between what we believe and how we behave. And if we perceive the other as less than what they ought to be, well, we have every right in one way or another to go out there and change them, either through proclaiming a better culture or through the barrel of a gun. So what I'm really suggesting, and it's what I spend my life doing these days, in my old age, that when we look at religion, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, the three Abrahamic faiths, we've got to acknowledge that there are layers and layers of rubble, discarded beliefs, outworn creeds, shattered illusions, and yes, the bones of flawed heroes. And we've got to dig through that in order to rediscover the liberatory dimensions of the three great religions to which I have referred. And what is that liberatory dimension? It is there in the so-called 8th century Hebrew prophets. It's social justice. It is there in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Christians kind of forget about him and talk about the Christ. This Jesus who lived among the poor, the oppressed, and was ultimately crucified for sedition. It is there in the person of the Prophet Muhammad, who was driven out of Mecca and went back to Mecca. The person who opposed the oppression and the corruption of the ruling class that drove him out. So that's basically what I want to say, is what we believe about God translates into the way in which we behave. The way in which we behave. Now let me come to my second and final point. Culture. More than that light cloak, it's in the marrow of our bones. How do we change it? Yes, there are all sorts of wonderful things we've got to do. We've got to ensure that we respect one another's faith. We respect different cultures. We're all the same. We're all one. You know, God loves us all. We've got to do all that sort of stuff. But I am arguing that without a serious adjustment of the structures that we have created, without a serious adjustment of those, we're in serious trouble. And so, human dignity involves far more than a charitable donation, far more than paying our zakat, far more than a tithe. It's radical change. It means a commitment to all human beings across the planet to ensure that all people can live a halfway decent life and hopefully even experience human dignity. This means, to be very, very practical, if the United States of America signs on to the International Paris Climate Accord, if it has any dignity, it will honor it. And there are many other accords which have to be upheld. You know, climatologists and other clever analysts tell us that the chances are that we on Earth will face the 6th extinction, possibly within 100 years. Michael Mann says it could come from 3 sources. 1, a nuclear war. Number 2, suffocation from pollution. Number 3, starvation from global warming. And, says Michael Moore in his own colorful way, maybe they'll all come together in a magic and single and perfect storm. So to be human goes beyond being kind to the next door neighbor. It involves involving ourselves in major agreements with all kinds of people to ensure the survival of the planet. And guess, pollution, starvation. Who's going to feel that most? The United States of America and the first world? Or the developing world? Africa, where we come from. What about North Korea? What about these places? What about Nigeria? Boko Haram. What about Somalia? Al-Shabaab. Are they also worthy of human dignity? In order to operationalize this, we have to institutionalize this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles, Doug, and Atalia for your comments and conversations. Doug, just I must apologize for me being so parochial and thinking American about free speech. But free speech only becomes absolute when it comes to Islam. Right? And then it becomes an absolute right. So I was wrong in that. I think one of the interesting things in what Charles and Atalia connected, and also the very fine points that Doug made, was the whole question. You know, I've been struggling, for instance, when I talk to colleagues about, say, for instance, ISIS, right? And some people in the region say they have to be destroyed. And policymakers elsewhere, also in Washington and elsewhere, say they have to be destroyed. There's no other option. And I wonder to what extent that very much approach to completely annihilate them, we use the word annihilated and so on, to what extent that undermines our very understanding of the question of human dignity. And so it seems that, as Atalia, using Judith Butler, talks about, that some lives are destructible. They're already destructible. And your question, Charles, you said, you know, Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, all these bad actors. How do we deal with that? What are the institutions that humanize? And I think your points are very, very much in line with the way we're trying to think. How do we institutionalize those things? That's very critical observations from each one of you. So we got about 10 minutes left, and I was wondering, we can answer our questions amongst ourselves. We can have other opportunities for dinner tonight, but I would like to open it up to the floor for questions, comments, and so on. So I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, 4 from this side, then I'm going to go that side. Yes, Nasser.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, wait for the mic, sorry.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed from the panel and for this distinguished and dignified speech. My question is towards Professor Kassan and also Professor Musa. One of the articles in the UN Charter that Professor Kassan read is all human beings are born free and equal with dignity, reasoning, and conscience. Now, my question is that when you attach the birth, the reasoning, and the conscience, it excludes the fetus and the embryo that Professor Musa was talking at, and it excludes the people without reasoning, such as crazy people. So I want to understand this dilemma within this article. And second, regarding the who decides, I don't know whether it is about who decides or what is the source. If we are talking about the source, then in Islamic law, we have Dawran al-Tasalsul, means circulation of the answer. If we ask a question and it does not have answer that can end, then we are in circulation process. And when we are in circulation process, we live in an anxiety. So this is towards Professor Musa. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we should take a few questions. We'll take the question for the gentleman right there. Then is that okay? You take it too.
We're going to have to leave. Students at about 10 up because we have a class with other students.
We'll be done then.
Just so you know.
Thank you all for speaking. So I have a question for Professor Omer and Professor Vicencio. So Professor Omer, you talked about the interconnectedness between just like, for example, Palestinian oppression and, anti-Black cop shootings here in America. I'm a little bit fuzzy on the exact mechanism that connects the two, or really any of these interconnected things. How does dealing with one, ameliorate another? And Professor Vicencio, you talked about the idea that we project God and then we try to act according to that. I guess I'm wondering what your reasoning is for that. Like, why is it not the case that like God actually does exist and we're modeling our behavior off something that does exist? And then with your idea of digging through sort of the rubble of these old systems that we've passed, at the bottom, I heard you say something like social justice is at the bottom. That's the real thing. Why think social justice is any more real than our projection of God? Why not both be projections? Thank you.
You can take a third question, then we're going to try and answer these very important questions.
Professor Charles just talked about correlation in what we believe and how we behave, and you also talked about culture. But what happens when you create this sense of belief and you create this culture where othering and demonizing becomes very easy? I mean, I don't know, possibly 90% of the globe knows what 9/11 looks like because we all know, we all saw it, whichever part of the world we were in, irrespective of our age, and what it leads to, which means how you are able to do that othering and demonizing and how it impacts. So that whose dignity can you push and whose dignity assumes importance?
Okay, I think the first question was directed to me and you, Doug, about the question of, Nasser, your student was asking the question about how do we decide between the dignity of the fetus, I think you said, and the what was the other one? And the article in the UN Charter which attaches the birth. That has what? Which attaches the condition of birth and reason. Of birth and reason, yes, and what is the dignity of people who don't have reason? I mean, my answer would be that the fetus also has dignity. People who don't have reason also have dignity. Nature has dignity. I think that when we make certain kind of engagements with nature or certain kinds of engagement with people in vulnerable positions and so on, doesn't mean that we become undignified in that. The question would be, when you have to make certain decisions about the life of the fetus and the life chances of that fetus, given the condition of the mother, we're into a very difficult terrain and we have high levels of anxiety. I can tell you from my own experience, when people ask me those questions in South Africa about abortion, and South Africa has some what others would call very liberal abortion laws. But just given the conditions in where abortions take place and under which economic and political conditions, my attitude was very different from when I come to a developed country like the United States with huge institutions to take care of unwanted children and a variety of networks. My position changes because the conditions of the survivability of those unwanted children is very different from that in South Africa. And so I think these things are very deeply contextual. It also got to do with the socio-political conditions that prevail that makes dignity, different kinds of dignity possible. And so I'm not going to articulate and say which one is better, but I think we have to struggle with those issues and we need to optimize South Africa, that unwanted children could also have chances of survival in the way they do, say, in Germany or in the United States. But there are also ways, and there's a long journey for South Africa to get there, given the conditions under which people live there. Doug.
You're actually referring to Article 1 of the Universal Declaration, and I'll repeat what it says. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, period, full stop. All human beings, no exceptions. People who, for whatever reason, have mental injuries, perhaps birth defects. It goes on to say, separately, they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act in a spirit of brotherhood. But that doesn't condition the first sentence. We all have dignity. Obviously, when a baby is first born, its conscience and reason are extremely limited. It's understood that you will mature with age, and it's understood that people maturing with age will have different degrees of reason and different degrees of conscience. But we all have dignity. That's the whole point of international human rights law. No exceptions.
There was a question for Charles and Atalia.
Okay, I can start. Well, there is a lot to unpack in what I telegraphed in my remarks. At the heart of the analysis is an analysis and argument about the biopolitical continuum and Foucauldian notion of biopolitics. But really, I mean, in terms of the connections that are being drawn in the movement of marginalized people are very real, very empirically real. Where, for instance, when Ferguson happened and people in Ferguson faced police brutality, Palestinians I mean, it was really quite phenomenal, went on Twitter and gave advice on how to deal with tear gas, because manufactured by the same American company. So the point about the level of analysis is to identify. So when Cornel West talks about Gaza as the hood on steroids, he is making a structural analysis of interlocking sides of injustice and power, and this is what and this has become very instrumental in articulating co-resistance. So it's not all those struggles, they're not the same, but they involve an analysis, a global level analysis that connects the dots. So this is what, so when I cited Du Bois, point about beyond the color line, even though the color line in Jim Crow's America was very real as social fact, when he went to Warsaw, he was able to see it from a different perspective that connected the what he saw in Warsaw, or the history that was there, and his own experiences, and that was really empowering in terms of analyzing the kind of the interconnections that then goes back to the question of the ungrievables. Yeah.
Charles, about the projection of God in social justice under the rubble.
Okay, very, very quickly. None of us can get out of our skin. I can only project anything in terms of my location, my place, my finitude in life. That's all. Now, I didn't want to waste your time with all sorts of academic stuff, but I'm happy to do so at some other time. I want to suggest we went wrong after a very, very important religious debate in the 12th century. Now listen to this, listen to this, listen to this. Depending how we're going to pronounce his name, either Ibn Rushd,
Averroes,
otherwise Averroes, a Islamic philosopher, who influenced, was the major influence on Maimonides and the major influence on Thomas Aquinas. And that theology is loosely called an apophatic theology, a negative theology. All we can do is say, yes, God exists. I'm aware of that. I'm not in a position to tell you what that God looks like. Because if I was raised in Pakistan, I would have a certain perception. If I'm raised in Western Christian places, I'd have a perception. So I would say, that's all we can do. All I can do is say that God exists. And I'm not so damn arrogant as to tell you what that God looks like. Now, what about social justice? If we believe anything about the creation of this unknown God, it means we've all got to be equal. And that, in my opinion, in the modern world in which we live today, involves the creation of institutions and structures that reflect human dignity. And we don't have them.
Thank you, Charles. And I want to thank the panel for their participation. I want to not keep you here for any longer. But let me just say the following, that it seems that from our panel discussion and maybe some of my pre-existing concepts I had, is that if we want to universalize dignity, and from what I heard from the panelists, then we need to have solidarity with the oppressed and the marginalized. That is indispensable. Otherwise, dignity just becomes one more thing in our vocabulary of hypocrisy. And therefore, we need to have it there. Thank you very much.
You saved your punch for the punch. It's great. Yes, is it the
There's an announcement that there's a protest of the murals at 4:30 at the main building. And we are available for conversation if you want to. Thank you. Our panelists are available for conversation if you want to talk to them.